and welcome to this episode of Ireland's Native Trees. In this episode we're going to talk about the birch tree. We're going to talk about the birch tree and its context in the Irish landscape. We're going to talk about how to identify the Irish birch trees. We're going to talk about what it does for us, how it helps support us and keep us alive, and all of the different biological diversity, the biodiversity that birch trees support. And we're in no better place than in Glenveigh National Park. And Glenveigh, of course, means Valley of Birch. So it's really Valley of Birch National Park that we're in, Valley of this tree that's behind me here. And at one stage, these trees would have grown right over the mountains. Birch is a very hardy, very tough tree. It can grow up at very high altitudes. It can take very poor soils. And all of Ireland, of course, was covered in forestry, and the more marginal lands would have been covered in trees like birch. Birch is what they call a pioneering tree. It's a tree that tends to take over an area that has been abandoned. So if you see an old building site or an old ruin or an old quarry, quite often one of the first trees starting to take over that area and starting to establish itself, to establish the woodland, is birch. And birch then, of course, captures so much carbon from the sky, and it drops its leaves every year, being a deciduous tree. And that leaves little packets of nutrition that in turn get eaten up and get turned into soil. And birch tends to improve the soil and make the soil a little bit better, a little bit richer. So eventually the dominant species, oak, will have a chance of coming in and getting a foothold. So to identify any tree, there are three things to watch out for. One is the leaf, one is the seed or the fruit, and one is the bark. And we have two species of birch tree that are native to Ireland. In the more acidic soils and the more boggy land, on the west coast, the north coast, we tend to have downy birch. And downy birch has very fine, very small little soft hairs along its branches, especially along its newer branches, those downy hairs, hence it gets its name. And birches that people will be more familiar with in the Midlands and the south of Ireland are silver birch. Silver birch that grows a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, and its branches tend to hang down a little bit more. To identify our birch, we first look at our leaves. And the leaves are small, about half the length of my thumb. Sometimes the lower leaves can get a little bit bigger, the ones that are looking for more light. But in general, the leaves are small and they're jaggedy or serrated at the edge. And they're in the shape of a little triangle or a little diamond. Always good to feel a leaf when you're trying to identify them. They're very smooth, slightly shiny on the outer side. A mature birch tree can produce a huge amount of seeds. One mature birch tree can produce 1 million seeds per year. That's one of the reasons that it's able to take over an area so quickly and spread so quickly. You can see here the little catkins that will form next year's seeds. But this year's seeds, as it's early autumn, are in this little form here. And you can see these little seeds. Each one of them has a little set of wings and a tiny, tiny seed in the middle. And when they are ripe and they're ready to go, as these ones are, they will dry out on the branch and then they will blow in the wind. And they can spread for at least 1 kilometre. These tiny, tiny little seeds. And each one of these little dots in my hand has the potential to turn into a mighty big birch tree like this, producing 1 million seeds per year and living for 80, 90 or 100 years itself. The bark of birch trees is something that really stands out. Silver birch, of course, has very silvery bark, but downy birch also has that kind of whitish or silvery bark. But it can be nearly a wine colour higher up in the younger branches. So in the winter time, a big stand of downy birch really jumps out from a distance. You see that lovely wine colour. When you see that, you know you're looking at a good stand of birch. The bark itself comes in many layers and it peels off a little bit like paper. In fact, it was used as paper in the ancient times. And you can see this bark cracking and peeling off here now. It's a good way of identifying birch. Birch trees themselves support a huge amount of biological diversity or different living things. Hundreds of different types of insects use birch trees either to eat the leaves or to find shelter in, or to hunt for other insects. And then again, spiders will hunt them, and birds will hunt those spiders and those insects. All of those seeds, some of them will be eaten by different bird species, some of our smaller bird species. So it provides a huge amount of food for our flying animals. Those insects in turn will feed bats, will provide food for bats that will hunt above the canopies of the birch. And then on the bark of birch, you will have different species of lichen and of mosses growing. Some of our larger animals, like the red deer, or our fastest land animal, the hare, they like to graze on birch leaves, the ones that they can access, or on young birch saplings. And then birch, by colonizing, by taking over an area, and by slowly but surely improving the soil of an area, provide shelter, provide refuge for many different animals that live amongst us.